In this Diablo 4 video, I'm going to be showing you my Cold Archer build. This is an update to the Cold Archer build we did in the beta. We've changed a few skills around, and it's definitely much more potent than it was in the beta, simply by changing a couple things. And this build is aimed at World Tiers 1 and 2, and sort of a starter rogue build that aims at focusing on using marksman skills, and sort of like a ranged build versus a melee rogue build. So the general strategy here is we're going to use combo points to build up and use Barrage, and Barrage gets extra arrows when you use more combo points. So you want to try and fire this every time you have 3 combo points if possible. And what I really like about Barrage is it's kind of the middle ground between Puncturing Shot and Rapid Fire, where Puncturing Shot is really good at AoE, but it's not very good against single target damage, because its claim to fame is that it goes through the enemy. But if you're facing like a boss or an elite or something, that's not always super helpful. And Rapid Fire is really good against bosses, but it's not very good against packs of enemies. And Barrage kind of has a little of both worlds. If an enemy is standing right in front of you, it's going to get hit with almost all of your Barrage shots. And if there is nothing in front of you, it's going to ricochet around and hit a lot of enemies on the screen, giving you some AoE damage. So it's kind of a nice middle ground, and it works really well for this build. And what I like about Puncture is it has a nice spread to it. It attacks very rapidly, so it's easy to build up combo points quickly in between barrages. And it also sets vulnerable if you hit something rather close, because you have to hit them with 2 blades, and that allows you to deal increased damage. Rogues have a big focus on dealing vulnerable damage or dealing extra damage to vulnerable enemies. So that's really good for this build, and since you need to cast it anyway in order to charge up your Barrage, has a really nice synergy. And then also on Barrage, the Enhanced Barrage passive makes it so that if you hit a vulnerable enemy or critically strike an enemy, you guaranteed to get a ricochet. So this is really nice too, because if you set vulnerable on an enemy and then hit him with Barrage, you're definitely going to get bounces off them, particularly if you fire into like a boss or something, or an elite that's standing right in front of you and they're vulnerable, and you hit them with every arrow. Every one of those arrows is going to ricochet, hitting enemies around them. I also have Dash in this build, and that's really for mobility in order to get away from enemies. But once you upgrade this with the Discipline Dash upgrade, it will actually slow enemies that you travel through. And this is great because if you have damage against crowd-controlled enemies or damage against slowed enemies, this is going to increase your damage against them. And Puncture also slows enemies as well when it hits them. So having damage against slowed or crowd-controlled is really good for this build, and you want to be on the lookout for those on, your equipment in order to boost your damage further. Beyond that, I'm using Poison Trap. This deals really good damage, and it has a smallish AoE. It's good when you're in a group of enemies, or if you're like up on top of a boss fighting it. You deal some increased damage. You can knock enemies down, which will increase your damage again to knock down enemies. So if you have increased damage versus crowd control, this is really good. And once we get the Countering Poison Trap upgraded to this, it has a 30% chance to reset your imbuement cooldown when you use. Now this normally wouldn't be that great in my opinion, and it's not 100% necessary for this build, but we do use 2 imbuement skills, so if you have them both on cooldown when you pop this, or maybe you've popped one and it's like loaded up for your next attack even if you haven't done it yet, you can get it back off cooldown sometimes, and that's really helpful. A good alternative to this skill if you're looking for something with a bit more AoE is the Caltrop skill. This slows enemies inside it and does damage over time. It doesn't do a huge amount of damage, but it has a much larger AoE than the Poison Trap skill. And when you upgrade it to deal cold damage and set chilled with enemies in it, you're going to get increased damage against chilled and frozen enemies from passives that I'll show you in just a second. So that's not a bad alternative if you're looking for something with a bit more AoE. It also has 2 charges, which means you can use it a little bit more frequently. So this brings us to Cold Imbuement. This is going to imbue your next 2 skills, Barrage or Dash in this case, with cold damage. It's going to change the damage to cold, and it's going to make it so that you chill enemies when you hit them. And what's really strong about this is that you're going to freeze enemies that can't move, and then you're just going to deal increased damage to them. We have the upgrade here that makes it so that you deal 20% more damage to crowd control enemies when you're cold imbued. So if you hit with like a Barrage into a frozen or chilled elite, it's going to deal 20% more damage. And then you double this if they're already frozen. Since you usually hit them enough to freeze them, you're going to deal an extra 40% damage with your second Barrage into them if you freeze them with the first. That's a huge amount of damage. And also what's really good too, if you have the enhanced modifier, is that your lucky hits with this skill when you're imbued are going to have a 30% chance to make enemies vulnerable. And there's a good synergy with that in Barrage, because enemies hit that are vulnerable with Barrage, the arrows will ricochet around more, so that's really nice. We also pick up and max out Frigid Finesse, and what this does is it gives you a passive damage increase to chilled enemies 15% and 30% that are frozen. So this is what I was saying earlier about Caltrops, is if that enemies walk inside it and they're chilled, they're instantly going to take 15% more damage from you. from any attacks you do to them. So there's a nice synergy there if you'd rather use that instead of Poison Trap. But this also helps with our cold imbued barrages, because you're definitely going to set chilled on enemies, so next arrow that hits after the first one that chills them is going to deal increased damage, and then again, if they're frozen, they're going to get 30% more damage. So you're going to get that 40% from the previous skill, and then you're going to get the 30% against frozen enemies. That's a lot of extra damage, and it really melts elites. And then next we have Poison Imbuement, and Poison Imbuement makes it so that you deal poison damage over time to enemies hit. And the reason we really have this is because Barrage is really good at spreading around status effects, and Cold Imbuement just takes too long to come off cooldown. Even with the Poison Trap, it just takes too long. So this gives you a second Imbuement that you can use, and you can alternate back and forth between these, using the Frozen one on like elites to burn them down really quickly, and then using Poison to spread around damage. So this works really, really well, and it's also good against elites as well, because you can stack poison dots onto a boss or an elite, and that'll help burn them down. And again, the synergy there with Poison Trap is that because you have two of these, it has a chance to reset both of them if they're off or on cooldown when you trigger it, so that's really nice as well. Which upgrades you take isn't particularly important for this one. You're going to get more poison damage either way. If you're building more for Lucky Hit, which is not a bad option for this build, you should focus on that one. And there are a lot of good poison passives here too that you want to pick up that reduce damage that poison enemies deal to you. You definitely are a little bit squishy as a rogue, so this one's good to pick up. You also get increased poison damage, and you also get increased attack speed for each enemy that's poisoned. This is really, really good because you're flinging your punctures really very fast with this build, and this will make it so that's even faster so you can get back to firing barrages. I also have Adrenaline Rush and Innervation maxed out here. Adrenaline Rush increases your energy generation while you're moving, which is almost constantly with this build. And Innervation makes it so that when you Lucky Hit, you have a 30% chance to gain 8 energy. Rogues have a huge problem with energy management, particularly in the game, at the beginning of the game. Their energy management is really, really bad. And if you're just starting out as a rogue, you've probably noticed this. So these two skills really help to alleviate a lot of our energy management problems, and that's why I picked them up. You may be able to dump them later on in the game if your energy management is okay, and there are a couple things we also do to help with energy management. These are absolutely crucial early on to help alleviate some of those energy management problems. Otherwise, you're just going to sit there and fling puncture. And also what's good about puncture, something I forgot to mention earlier, is that each time you hit an enemy with puncture that's crowd controlled, you gain 2 energy. So this really builds up your energy quickly, because we have a lot of ways of crowd controlling. If you're using caltrops, if you're using Poison Trap, if you're hitting enemies with Cold Imbuement, they'll be chilled. They'll be crowd controlled there. So there's a lot of ways to pick up crowd control. This really helps to replenish your energy, even if you're facing like a boss, because you can just get 6 energy every time you cast it, which is really, really nice. And then lastly, I have the Victimize key passive, and this makes it so that when you Lucky Hit, dealing direct damage to a vulnerable enemy has a 30% chance to cause an explosion, dealing 23% of the original damage to them and around enemies. This is really nice. You need to build a bit for Lucky Hit in this build, and early on in the game that's hard to do, but you do have a lot of ways of getting Lucky Hit. Arrows are bouncing around all over the place. You're setting vulnerable quite regularly with this build, and you need a little bit more AoE damage. This build's much better at focused fire on a single target. Still, at least has okay AoE, but it's not great compared to a lot of other builds. So this passive is really going to help you get that extra AoE from explosions. So you definitely want that in this build, and there aren't really too many other good key passives. You could pick up the one that increases your critical damage with marksmanship skills. We do use quite a few marksmanship skills in this build, but you don't really have a high crit chance at the beginning of the game. So it's probably, one or the other. It's probably not super important, and this key passive is going to get much better later than it is early on. So talking a bit about legendary aspects to look out for early on, this is kind of, for the first area or two of the game. I didn't include ones that would take you much longer to get, even though there are some good ones for this build. But one great thing about Rogue is they have 3 weapons equipped at all times. So this is fantastic because weapons use offensive legendary aspects, and a lot of builds, if they have, for instance, like Druid has a 2-handed weapon or a 1-hand and an offhand, and they can only get 1 weapon legendary aspect, or maybe 2 in some cases, depending on what you have, besides their rings and their gauntlet slot. Well, rogues have 2 extra effectively because they can have a 2-handed one and then 2 extra. So this is really strong, and you're going to get a lot more offensive aspects as you go through the game. One I like early on is the rapid aspect. This increases your basic attack speed by 30% if you have it on a 2-handed weapon. You can find this with higher values if you get it dropped, but if you're using the Codex of Power, it's 30%. This is really nice. This makes you attack very, very quickly with Puncture. This gets you your combos charged up quickly and back into Barrage. Another good pickup here is the aspect of the Expectant. This makes it so that when you attack enemies with a basic skill, the damage of your next core skill is increased. Because we basically alternate 3 basic skills at least, before we use a Barrage most of the time. This is fantastic for this build, and you should consider getting this one early on. The energizing aspect is phenomenal for this build. It makes it so anytime you damage an elite with a basic skill, you generate 3 energy. Since you usually get 6 energy from puncture, this could be 9, and you can get up to 13 if you have the highest roll on this early on in the game. This is really nice for energy management, and it can help alleviate some energy management problems you have. Another good one is aspect of corruption. This makes it so your imbuement skill effects have a 20 to 40% increased potency against vulnerable enemies. Because we set vulnerable so easily in this build, that's going to make it so enemies freeze faster. It's going to make it so they take more poison damage. Just really good for this build, particularly because we use 2 imbuments. And defensively, some good choices are aspect of the protector. This is really good in any build. This gives you a barrier when you damage an elite enemy. Rogues are squishy, so getting protection is very important for rogues, and this is a good way to get some easy protection. And cheats aspect is good. This makes it so that you receive less damage from crowd-controlled enemies. A lot of the enemies that you are facing in this game are crowd-controlled because you slow them with puncture, or you chill them with cold imbuement, or you drop them with poison trap, or you chill them with caltrops and slow them with caltrops, depending which one you're using. So this helps to reduce the damage you take, and again, rogues need damage reduction, so this is very good. And Mighty aspect is also good. This makes it so that you take 20% less damage for a few seconds after you use a basic skill. Since this usually happens a lot with this build because you're rotating between 3 basic skills and then Barrage, this helps to reduce the damage you take in the meantime, and that's great. Bonuses besides these things you want to look out for on your gear are vulnerable damage. You do a lot of vulnerable damage with this build, so that's one that's very, very important. Damage to crowd controlled. You have a lot of different crowd controls with this build, so anything that's to crowd control is good. Damage versus slow, damage versus chilled are both good. And critical chance and lucky hit are also very good for this. If you're talking about like defensively, you want damage reduction versus distant enemies because melee enemies are easy to get away from with the way you are mobile in this build. But ranged enemies will just keep whittling you down, and it's hard to constantly just keep dodging ranged attacks. So damage reduction versus distanced enemies is what you want to look for on the defensive side. So that wraps up the Cold Archer build. I hope that helped you kind of get off to a good start with an Archer build if you want to play one. This worked really, really well for me. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you think in the comments below.